My sister said, "Please don't come too close. We can't have you in the main photos." My parents nodded. I smiled. That night, they toasted under chandeliers at my vineyard, never realizing the land beneath their perfect wedding was mine. When the truth surfaced, the cameras stopped flashing, and the silence was louder than their applause. I'm Emily Carter, and this is my quiet revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The restaurant was glowing that night, the kind of soft gold light that makes everything look warmer than it really is. The sign outside read, "The Rose Garden, a place my mother loved for its old money charm." Inside, the table stretched almost the entire length of the private room. White linens, crystal glasses, and too many forks for a simple family dinner. Olivia sat in the center, her engagement ring catching the light every time she lifted her hand. She turned toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Emily." I was thinking she said lightly, her tone carrying that familiar edge of command. "Maybe you shouldn't sit too close to the stage during the wedding. It's just, well, the photographer needs clean lines. You know symmetry." My mother nodded before I could respond. "That makes sense. We want Olivia to shine that day." My father added, "You can sit near the back, sweetheart. That way Olivia won't be distracted. You understand." "I understand," I said quietly. My voice was calm, but I could feel the tightness in my throat. Around me, conversation floated easily, laughter spilling over glasses of Cabernet. Every eye at the table seemed fixed on Olivia, the golden child, the success story, the bride. Mom reached over to tuck a strand of Olivia's hair behind her ear, beaming. "You're going to be such a beautiful bride, honey." Olivia basked in the praise. We finally booked the venue. Rosewood Vineyard in Napa Valley. It's absolutely stunning. They only take a few weddings a year. Mom gasped, impressed. "That's where the mayor's daughter got married, right?" "Oh, Olivia, that's perfect." I took a sip of wine, letting it settle on my tongue before swallowing. The taste was sharp and a little bitter like the conversation itself. Olivia glanced at me, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "Don't worry, Em, we'll find you something simple to wear. Maybe a soft gray. I know budgets can be tight right now." Dad chuckled under his breath. "Your sister's just teasing." "No, it's fine," I said, forcing a smile. "I appreciate her thinking of me." Olivia laughed lightly as if that settled it. "You've always been so chill about things. That's what I like about you." They moved on to talk about caterers, photographers, floral arrangements. I sat there nodding when expected my mind elsewhere. In my head, my voice drifted like a quiet echo. I've learned my place in this family. There's always a spotlight, and it's never pointed at me. The waiter refilled our glasses, and the table shimmered with noise again, forks clinking, glasses tapping. I watched as Olivia showed my parents photos of the vineyard on her phone, the rolling hills, the stone archway, the fountain glittering in the sun. Mom sighed dreamily. "It's like something out of a movie." Dad looked proud. "Whatever my girl wants. It's your day, Olivia." "Thank you, Daddy," she said, leaning over to kiss his cheek. I stared down at the linen napkin in my lap. It felt almost theatrical, this scene we played every time the doting parents, the perfect daughter and me. The quiet one, the one they never quite figured out. The conversation circled back to money as it often did. Olivia mentioned the cost of the flowers, $40,000. And Dad just nodded like that was the price of love. She turned to me again, tilting her head. "You're still doing that software thing, right? Freelancing or consulting or something?" "Something like that." I said. "Good," she replied, her tone bright. "Well, don't worry about the dress. I mean, if it's a stretch, we can cover part of it. I don't want you stressing about expenses." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, just careless, which somehow made it worse. I took another sip of wine and smiled, though I could feel my jaw tightening. They laugh, and I laugh too, I thought, but we're not laughing for the same reasons. The waiter cleared our plates, bringing dessert. Olivia announced plans for a rehearsal dinner at the Fairmont Hotel, how she'd booked a string quartet, how Daniel's family was simply over the moon. When she said Daniel's name, her eyes softened. I watched her carefully. For all her vanity, she did love him. Maybe that was something real. By the time the check arrived, Dad was already reaching for his wallet. Olivia kissed Mom's cheek and stood Daniel appearing at her side, tall and polished, in his navy suit. "Thanks for dinner," she said. "We'll head out. Early meeting with the florist tomorrow." "Drive safe," Dad said, waving as they left. The room grew quieter once they were gone. The waiter blew out one of the candles, and a thin curl of smoke rose into the air. I gathered my purse, stepping outside into the cool night. Downtown San Francisco shimmered in the distance lights, reflecting off car windows and puddles from a brief evening rain. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the cold air wash over me. Through the restaurant window, I could still see the table we'd shared, empty now, except for the half-drained glasses. In my mind, the thought came uninvited, calm and steady. If they only knew who really owns the place they're about to celebrate in. A cab passed by, headlights flashing across my face. I pulled my coat tighter, started walking toward the parking lot, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself a real smile. Small secret, and entirely my own. The city glowed ahead, but I no longer needed its light. 13 years ago, I was still trying to become someone they could be proud of. Looking back now, I'm not sure they ever really saw me at all. It was 2010. My apartment in Palo Alto looked like every other startup dream. Half-empty pizza boxes, cables snaking across the floor, 2 monitors glowing in the dark. I'd been awake for 30 hours straight, headphones on running code that kept crashing at the same line. I didn't even look up when my phone buzzed. Dad's name flashed on the screen. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. His voice was polite but distant, the way people talk to strangers they used to know well. "Still doing those little projects?" I rubbed my eyes. "They're not little, Dad. I think I've finally found a framework that works." He paused. "You know there's an opening at the firm. Olivia could help you get in. It's steady work, good salary. No reason to keep scraping by on side gigs." "I'm fine," I said. "I just want to see this through." He sighed. "Well, call your mother once in a while." The line clicked dead. I set the phone down and stared at the wall until the screensaver lit the room. In another part of town, Olivia was probably sitting in a glass office, polished nails, tapping on a desk, our father's employees calling her Miss Carter. I imagined her heels clicking on marble floors, her confidence filling the room. Mine, on the other hand, was measured in coffee cups and unfinished code. That night, I pushed the laptop aside and leaned back in the chair, dizzy from exhaustion. For a second, I almost believed the little voice in my head that said he was right. Then I saw the test data flash green. The line of code finally ran. I laughed out loud alone in the room. No one would ever know this moment but me. But it was enough. A week later, I met Mark Evans for the first time. I'd found his name through a startup legal forum. He looked younger than I expected. Mid-30s, sharp suit, tired eyes that had seen too many bad ideas. "I'll be honest," he said after listening to my pitch. 90% of founders who walk into my office don't make it past a year. But you," he leaned forward, "you sound like someone who won't stop until she does." I smiled, unsure how to react. "That's the nicest thing anyone said about my work." "I'm not being nice," he said. "I'm making a bet." He helped me incorporate CloudFrame systems 2 weeks later. I remember signing the papers at a coffee shop, my laptop open beside the stack of forms. He bought the coffee, said it was for luck. For the next 5 years, my life became a loop of caffeine code and silence. I slept on a futon. In the same apartment, missed birthdays, ignored dating apps, watched Olivia's promotions appear on LinkedIn. She was the family's rising star. I was the sister they mentioned with polite confusion. Once in a while, Mom would call. "Your sister just made vice president, did you hear? You should be proud of her." I'd say, even though I wasn't sure if pride could coexist with invisibility. By 2000, CloudFrame had finally landed its first real contract, a logistics company in San Jose. I remember the email subject line, "Partnership Proposal, Confirmed." I sat frozen for a full minute before the joy hit me like a rush of caffeine. I called Mark first. "We did it," I said, laughing. "They actually signed." He chuckled. "I told you persistence wins. Now get some sleep before you code yourself into the hospital." That night, I wrote a quick email to Dad. "CloudFrame just got its first client. We're profitable now. Love, Em." No reply came. Days passed. The inbox stayed empty. A week later, I got a text from Olivia instead. "Good job. Keep it up." I stared at the screen, wondering if Dad had even told her. Maybe he had. Maybe she just sent the message out of obligation. Either way, it was something, and nothing. Outside, it started to rain, the soft kind that barely makes a sound but soaks through everything. I sat by the window watching the drops chase each other down the glass. Inside the dim light of my apartment, the monitors glowed like 2 small moons. I thought about all the nights I'd spent here trying to prove I could build something on my own. I thought about how easy it would be to give up, to call Olivia, and ask for help to finally take a seat at my father's firm, but I didn't. I turned the screen back on and went to work. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered, "They may never see you, but you see yourself." The code compiled clean. I hit enter. The server hummed to life. For a moment, the room seemed brighter. Years later, when everything changed, I would remember that sound, the soft click of success in an empty room, and realize it was the only approval I ever really needed. The contract was thicker than a novel, a stack of papers that smelled faintly of ink and money. We sat around a glass table in Macronet Corporation's San Francisco office, the skyline shimmering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The CEO, a man in his 50s with a smile practiced for boardrooms, leaned forward and said, "Once you sign, this Emily Cloudframe officially becomes part of Macronet's innovation division. Congratulations." I held the pen for a moment before lowering it to the page. My hand trembled slightly. 10 years of my life distilled into a few black lines on white paper. Mark Evans sat across from me, calm as always, his tie perfectly straight. After today, he said quietly, "You'll finally have freedom. But remember, the non-disclosure agreement is airtight. No one can know you were the principal founder." I nodded. I'm used to being invisible. He gave me a look, half concern, half pride, but said nothing more. The CEO clapped his hands, signaling to the others that it was done. I shook hands with men in suits. I didn't know, smiled for a photos that would never include my name, and then walked out into the bright California sun. I sold 10 years of my life to buy silence. And for the first time in years, silence felt like peace. The next few weeks blurred together. I moved out of my old apartment, donated most of my furniture, and rented a small place in Pacific Heights. The space was neat, almost empty. White walls, one sofa, one table, a single orchid on the windowsill. I'd made enough from the sale to never work again, but wealth didn't feel like I imagined it would. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like quiet. Mom called a few weeks later. "So, are you looking for work yet? Your sister just got promoted to senior partner at the firm. Isn't that wonderful?" I pressed the phone to my ear, watching sunlight creep across the hardwood floor. "That's great for her. I'm fine, Mom." "You sure, sweetheart? You've been quiet lately." "I'm okay," I said, and before she could ask more, I hung up gently. The next morning, I picked up a business magazine at the coffee shop down the street. Olivia's face smiled back at me from the cover. "The Carter Legacy." The headline read, featuring her and Dad standing in the lobby of their investment firm. She looked radiant, confident, everything he had ever wanted in a child. I flipped the page and turned to the classifieds. A few days later, I found myself driving north on Highway 29 through the soft, rolling hills of Napa Valley. I'd told Mark I was taking a short trip to clear my head. He smiled, said I deserved it, and didn't ask questions. The vineyards stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, neat rows of vines basking in the late afternoon light. It smelled of soil and summer, and something older than ambition. When I arrived at Rosewood Estate, I almost turned around. The iron gate opened slowly, revealing a long drive lined with olive trees and lavender. At the end stood a Mediterranean-style villa, elegant but weathered with sunlight bouncing off its terracotta roof. A woman was waiting on the porch, a petite figure in her 70s hair, white as salt, wearing a straw hat and a linen dress. "You must be Ms. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Catherine Rosewood." Her grip was firm. "Thank you for seeing me," I said. "Your agent mentioned you might be considering selling." She smiled wistfully. "Considering, yes. Deciding, not so much. My husband and I built this place 40 years ago. He passed away 2 summers back. The vines are still strong, but the upkeep..." She gestured around. "It's time for someone else to love it." We walked together down the rows of vines. Grapes hung heavy, catching the golden light. "Everyone who's come here talks about its potential," she said. "Events, weddings, branding opportunities. I don't want a marketer. I want a caretaker." I stopped to touch one of the vines rough under my fingertips. "It's beautiful," I said. "You can feel how much life is still here." "Mrs. Rosewood studied me for a moment. "Why do you want it?" I thought of all the years I'd spent building something invisible, of the silence that followed every success, because I've spent my whole life creating things that live inside screens. I'd like to create something that breathes. She nodded slowly. Most people want this estate for what it says about them. You're the first one who seems to want it for what it is. We spent the afternoon walking the property, through the old wine cellar, the gardens, the guest cottages that looked out over the valley. The air grew cooler, turning honey-colored as the sun dipped behind the hills. When we returned to the villa, she poured 2 glasses of rosé and sat across from me. "You remind me of myself when I was young," she said softly. "I was always afraid people would forget me. But the truth is, places like this don't forget the ones who care for them." I looked around the room, the worn stone floor, the scent of oak barrels and lavender drifting through the open windows. "How much are you asking?" She hesitated, then said, 13 million too, including the vineyard villa and remaining event contracts. I didn't flinch. "I'll take it." Her eyebrows lifted. "Just like that?" "Just like that. I pulled out my phone and called Mark. "Draw up the offer," I said. By the time we finished the paperwork, twilight had settled over the valley. I stood outside watching the lights flicker on across the hills. Somewhere in the distance, a string quartet was rehearsing at another vineyard, the faint notes floating through the air. Mrs. Rosewood joined me on the porch. "You'll take good care of it," she said. "I can tell. I'll try." I said. She smiled. "This place doesn't want perfection. It just wants someone who listens." Later, driving back down the dark road toward the city, I rolled down the window and let the cool wind rush in. The contract sat on the passenger seat beside me, the ink still fresh. I didn't buy Rosewood to show anyone what I had. I bought it to hear the world again. For the first time in a decade, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like home. The wedding invitation arrived on a quiet April morning, tucked between bills and a postcard from a winery I'd never been to. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, embossed with gold lettering. "Olivia Carter and Daniel Henderson request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. Rosewood Vineyard, Napa Valley." I stared at the address for a long moment before the irony hit me. Of all the vineyards in California, my sister had chosen mine. I set the card on the kitchen counter next to a mug of cold coffee. The morning light slanted through the blinds, painting lines across the marble surface. "Rosewood Vineyard," I whispered to myself. Of course she did. It wasn't anger I felt, more like a small, amused ache somewhere deep inside. That night, my parents invited me to dinner. Olivia was already seated when I arrived, glowing in her white blouse and pearl earrings, her engagement ring catching the chandelier light every time she moved. Daniel sat beside her, polite and perfectly silent, like someone aware that the real conversation wasn't his to join. As soon as I sat down, Olivia clapped her hands lightly. "So she announced, the date is set, June 10th. We'll be getting married at Rosewood Vineyard. Isn't that amazing?" Mom gasped, delighted. "Oh, Olivia, that's such an exclusive venue. I read that celebrities get married there. You always had such good taste." Dad smiled proudly. "My girl never does anything halfway." Olivia grinned. "Exactly. I wanted something timeless but elegant. Rosewood is just perfection. It's what every bride dreams of." I watched her talk, her voice smooth, and practiced the kind of confidence that came from being constantly validated. My fingers traced the edge of the napkin on my lap, the fabric rough beneath my thumb. I thought about the day I'd signed the deed with Mrs. Rosewood, the soft click of the pen, the look in her eyes when she said, "This place just needs someone who listens." Mom's voice snapped me back. "You'll be there, of course, Emily. It'll be nice for you to see something that fancy up close." "Of course," I said. "Wouldn't miss it." Olivia leaned forward, her tone honeyed but sharp around the edges. "Just try not to go overboard with your outfit, okay? We're going for cohesive colors, soft tones, maybe something simple." I smiled. "Don't worry. Simple's what I do best. And don't stress about a gift," she added quickly. "You showing up is more than enough." "I mean, it's not like you need to impress anyone." Mom nodded. "That's true, honey. Just be comfortable and enjoy the day. You don't need to draw attention." I folded my hands neatly on the table. "I've never been very good at drawing attention, have I?" Dad chuckled, not realizing the weight in my voice. "And that's what we love about you, kiddo. You keep things low-key." Dinner went on, with their easy laughter filling the gaps. They discussed flowers, caterers, even the champagne selection, while I sat quietly watching them build their perfect world brick by brick. At one point, Olivia showed Mom pictures of the vineyard on her phone. The same view I saw every morning from my kitchen window. The fountain, the villa, the stretch of vines down the hill. "Isn't it gorgeous?" she said. Mom sighed. "It's like something from a fairy tale." Olivia beamed. "Daniel's parents are thrilled. They said it's the classiest venue in Napa." Daniel smiled awkwardly, glancing at me. "It's really beautiful," he said. "It is." I agreed, meeting his gaze for a moment before looking back at my plate. After dessert, as we waited for the check, Olivia launched into her list of bridesmaids, photographers, and magazine features. They might do a spread on us in California life. They want to highlight successful couples. Can you imagine? Mom's face glowed with pride. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Our family could use a little press." I tried not to laugh. The irony was almost too much. When dinner ended, we all hugged goodbye. Olivia smelled like expensive perfume and accomplishment. Mom kissed my cheek and said, "Don't forget to RSVP, dear. I'm sure they need final numbers soon. I'll take care of it," I said. Outside, the evening air was soft and warm. I stood by my car for a while, staring at the streetlights reflecting off the windshield. Somewhere between amusement and disbelief, a quiet calm settled over me. When I got home, the house was dark except for the soft glow from the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the counter, the invitation still lying where I'd left it that morning. I ran my finger over the embossed lettering, the careful spacing of their names. My phone buzzed. A message from Nora, the vineyard manager. "All paperwork finalized. Rosewood Estate is officially under your name." I set the phone down and exhaled slowly. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. I walked to the window, opened it, and let the cool, night air sweep in. The lights from the valley flickered faintly in the distance, where my vineyard lay quiet under the stars. Sometimes the only answer worth giving is silence. Because silence, if you wait long enough, speaks louder than anything else. The rehearsal dinner glowed like something out of a magazine spread. Soft amber lighting, white roses on every table, champagne flutes catching the light. From the moment I walked into Rosewood Hall, I felt the familiar hum of conversation. The kind of polished laughter that only happens when people know they're being watched. Olivia stood near the head table, radiant in a white cocktail dress that shimmered under the chandeliers. Daniel was beside her, perfectly composed, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. She looked like a painting, elegant, framed, and very aware of the frame. The hostess guided me toward a table at the far end of the room, behind a marble column near the entrance. I could see everyone, but no one could really see me. "This will be fine," I told her, though she looked uncertain. From my seat, I watched Olivia glide through the room, greeting guests, air-kissing her friends from the firm, and thanking Daniel's parents for the wine shipment they'd sent from Sonoma. Mom and Dad sat up front, beaming like proud royalty, laughing a little too loudly at every toast. Someone turned and gestured in my direction. "That's Olivia's sister." "Right?" Olivia smiled and nodded. "Yes, that's Emily. She's sort of doing her own thing. Freelancing. Writes online, I think." A man in a navy suit chuckled. "A blogger, huh? How fun." Laughter rippled across the table. I smiled back and lifted my glass in a polite toast from afar. The music swelled, a string quartet playing a modern pop song that had been turned classical. The room sparkled, the air thick with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. From my seat, I could see the glowing logo on the projection screen, Olivia and Daniel. A celebration of love. It was perfect. It always was. My phone buzzed beside my plate. I glanced down and saw a message from Mark Evans. "Title transfer confirmed. Rosewood Estate is now officially under your name in Napa County records." I stared at the words for a few seconds before locking the screen. My reflection shimmered faintly in the dark glass, half of my face caught in light, half in shadow. Across the room, Olivia raised her glass for a toast. "To family," she said brightly. "To love and to new beginnings." Everyone clinked glasses, laughter following like applause. I whispered to myself, "For some of us, it's to endings too." When the waiter refilled my drink, I thanked him and stood, stepping quietly out of the main hall and into the courtyard. Outside, the night was cooler. The string lights above the patio swayed gently in the breeze, casting warm circles on the ground. From here, I could still hear the muffled music, the laughter, the faint sound of Olivia's voice carrying over the crowd. I leaned against the railing, holding my glass, watching the way the light fractured through the liquid. The air smelled faintly of wine and honeysuckle. Somewhere in the distance, crickets began to hum. I thought about the column that hid me inside the room, the invisible space that had been mine since childhood, always just outside the frame, always where no one would have to look at me. They believed I was a quiet sister, someone harmless, someone who didn't need to be included. That was fine, because true power didn't come from being seen. It came from knowing you could stand in plain sight and still keep a secret big enough to change the entire story. Through the glass doors, I could see Olivia laughing with Mom, both of them framed by the chandelier light. Daniel said something, and Olivia threw her head back, the picture of effortless grace. They thought they owned the night. They thought they controlled the narrative, but the ground beneath their perfect moment was already mine. The vineyard, the hall, the walls around them. All of it. I finished my drink and set the glass down on the railing. My phone buzzed again, another message from Mark. "Congratulations, Ms. Carter. It's official. You're the owner of Rosewood Estate." I smiled faintly. The word owner looked strange next to my name. For years I had built things that belonged to other people. Code systems, success stories. But this was different. This was solid. A gust of wind lifted a strand of my hair. Inside, the toast's continued voices blending with the music. For a moment I imagined what it would feel like to walk back into that room and tell them the truth, to watch their faces as the illusion cracked. But I didn't need to. Some things are more satisfying when they remain unsaid. I looked up at the sky. The stars were faint but steady, scattered above the dark hills. "Let them have their spotlight," I murmured. "I have everything else." The door opened behind me. One of the caterers stepped out, balancing a tray of empty glasses. "Everything okay out here, ma'am?" he asked. "Perfect," I said, smiling. He nodded and went back inside. I stayed there for another minute, listening to the muffled joy echoing through the glass doors. Then I turned and began walking down the path toward the edge of the vineyard, where the lights from the hall faded into darkness. The gravel crunched under my heels. I stopped and glanced back at the glow of the building, at the laughter spilling out into the night. They were celebrating a story they thought they owned. I walked on the sound of the party fading behind me until all I could hear was the soft rustle of leaves and the steady beat of my own footsteps. The night wrapped around me, gentle and full. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel lonely. It felt like power. The next morning, the phone on Olivia's nightstand buzzed before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She rolled over, groaning, and glanced at the screen. It was Sarah, her wedding planner. "Sarah, it's 7 a.m., Olivia muttered, pressing the phone to her ear. "I'm sorry to call so early," Sarah said, her voice tight, "but there's a small issue with the venue contract. We'll need to have it re-signed. There's been a change in ownership." Olivia sat up. "Change in ownership. What are you talking about?" "The wedding is in 5 weeks. I know." "I know," Sarah said quickly. "It looks like the property changed hands last week. I'm still waiting for the name of the new owner. It might just be a technical update, but the county requires a signature from whoever holds the deed." Olivia's eyes flashed. "Well, find out who it is. And if this delays my wedding, I'll sue the entire vineyard." Sarah's tone softened. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, Olivia. We'll handle it." Olivia hung up and immediately dialed Mom. "The vineyard changed ownership," she said, pacing the bedroom. "If they mess up this wedding, I'll take them to court." Mom tried to calm her. "Darling, let's not panic. These things happen. I'm sure your father can talk to someone. I don't want him to talk," Olivia snapped. "I want this fixed." Daniel appeared in the doorway, still in his robe, hair tousled. "Liv, what's going on?" She turned sharply. "The venue. They changed owners. Sarah says we have to re-sign the contract. Who does that? Who sells a vineyard right before a wedding?" He crossed the room and took her hands. "It's probably just paperwork. Don't spiral. This is my wedding, Daniel," she said, pulling away. "There is no room for error. Not with the press coming, not with Dad's clients. Everything has to be perfect." He sighed. "It will be." But even as he said it, he didn't sound convinced. While Olivia paced the room in panic, I was sitting in the office, overlooking those same vineyards, the morning sun slanting across the wide windows. Nora stood by the doorway holding a clipboard. "The lighting rig will be installed this week," she said. "The main hall has been repainted, and the terrace railing's been repaired. The place will be flawless." "Good," I said. "Keep the schedule as is. Don't let the upcoming wedding rush you. Everything should stay on course." Nora hesitated. "The Carter wedding is big, isn't it?" They've requested access to the bridal suite next week for a walkthrough. I smiled faintly. Yes, I've heard. Do you want me to be there when they arrive? No. Let Sarah handle it. I'd prefer to stay invisible for now. Nora nodded, jotting notes. You're very calm for someone who just took over a multi-million-dollar estate. I've been calm for a long time, I said. People make better mistakes when they think you're not paying attention. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask more. When she left, I looked out across the rows of vines, green and steady in the light. My reflection in the glass looked almost unfamiliar, composed, untouchable. When people worry about losing face, they forget they've already lost it. By midday, Sarah herself arrived at Rosewood for the contract signatures. I met her in the front hall where sunlight filtered through the tall windows. She looked flustered but professional, clutching a folder. Thank you for meeting me, Ms. Carter, she said. The new ownership took everyone by surprise, but the Carters, well, the bride and her family, are anxious to make sure everything proceeds smoothly. I nodded, offering her a seat. Of course. The last thing I want is to interrupt their plans. You can assure them all existing bookings will be honored exactly as before. Sarah exhaled in relief. That's wonderful to hear. Honestly, it's been chaos this morning. Mrs. Henderson, well, soon to be Mrs. Henderson, was quite upset. I smiled. Weddings bring out the best and worst in people. She laughed awkwardly. Isn't that the truth? She slid the papers across the table. If you could just sign here, we can finalize the confirmation. I signed in neat strokes, the pen gliding easily across the paper. My name looked strange above the bolded words, Owner Rosewood Estate. When she gathered her things, she said, Thank you again for being so accommodating. You're one of the most cooperative owners I've worked with. I just want everything to be perfect for them, I said, and meant it. It sounds like a beautiful wedding. She smiled warmly. It will be now. After she left, I lingered in the quiet hall, fingers tracing the cool surface of the marble table. Outside, workers were trimming hedges, setting up lanterns, preparing for yet another weekend event. Life at Rosewood continued as if nothing had changed, except that everything had. Later that afternoon, I sat in my office, again sipping tea, reviewing invoices. The estate felt alive, humming softly, like a machine that no longer needed to prove itself. From my window, the vineyard stretched endless, and green, steady under the sun. I thought about Olivia's voice from years ago, the way she used to call me, her little sister, like a title of pity. She'd always been terrified of imperfection, obsessed with the idea of control. But perfection is fragile. It breaks the moment you try to hold it too tightly. By evening, the sky turned the color of copper. Somewhere in San Francisco, my sister was probably staring at her wedding checklist, trying to wrestle the world into submission. At that exact moment, Olivia stood in her apartment, staring at her own reflection in the dark window. The spreadsheet on her laptop glowed with notes, deadlines, and color-coded tasks. The phone lay silent on the counter, but her hand was still clenched around it, knuckles white. Mom's voice echoed faintly in her head from their call earlier. Don't worry so much, sweetheart. You always make everything perfect. But perfection was starting to slip through her fingers. Back in Napa, I closed my laptop, leaned back, and looked out at the lights flickering over the vines. The air was cool, filled with the scent of lavender and earth. Sometimes what people fear most isn't failure. It's the realization that their whole life has been about avoiding it. And the only thing left to lose is the illusion that they ever had control. Morning light spilled across the vineyard like silk, soft and silver through the thin veil of fog. The air smelled faintly of coffee and dew. I stood by the window in my kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the mist lift slowly from the vines. Everything looked still peaceful, perfectly under control, until the laptop chimed. The email subject line read, From Mark Evans, urgent. I clicked it open. David Chen from the San Francisco Ledger has connected the dots. He knows you were the principal founder of CloudFrame. He's drafting a feature. Call me as soon as you can. I stared at the words for a while, the coffee cooling in my hands. The quiet around me felt suddenly louder. For 3 years I had lived in the shadow of anonymity. My name had been buried under corporate NDAs and legal clauses. I told myself that silence was peace. But maybe it had just been another kind of fear of being seen again. I closed the laptop and took a slow sip. The taste was bitter grounding. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Somewhere in San Francisco, a man named David Chen was probably scrolling through old press releases trying to match photos to rumors. Mark arrived 2 hours later, his car crunching over the gravel drive. He looked tired, his tie loosened, a phone pressed to his ear as he stepped inside the villa. "You've got a decision to make," he said, placing his phone face down on the table. "David's story is solid. He's got archived domain records. Old Git commits everything. If it runs, everyone will know you were behind CloudFrame." I sat across from him, calm. "Can you stop it?" "I can delay it, maybe, not stop it. Freedom of the press." "You know how that goes." I looked past him through the glass doors to the vineyard beyond. The sun had burned off most of the fog, now leaving the rows of vines in a golden haze. "Mark, do you remember when we sold the company?" He nodded. "Of course. You told me then that I'd earned my freedom, that no one would bother me again." He leaned forward. "You did. You have. But if this story runs, that freedom changes shape. The world loves a mystery, but it loves tearing one apart even more." I smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I ever had freedom. Just quiet. And maybe I don't need that anymore." He frowned. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure I'm tired of pretending I built nothing." He exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Then I'll let it run its course. But you should be ready for fallout. Family press investors. It'll stir everything up. I'm ready." He stood to leave, picking up his phone. "For what it's worth," he said, "it's about time people knew what you did." After he left, I walked outside. The workers were setting up for another small event, testing sound equipment near the ceremony area. A gentle breeze tugged at the white fabric draped over the wooden arch. The vineyard stretched quiet and endless under the morning light, pretending nothing had changed. I thought about the version of me they'd seen all these years. The quiet sister, the underachiever, the one who didn't quite fit. They'd built that image carefully, like a portrait they could hang on the family wall and forget about. And now, with one article, the paint would start to peel. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. Mom's name flashed across the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," she said too casually. "I just wanted to ask you something. Your sister mentioned that someone's been calling about CloudFrame, that company you used to do work for." My hand tightened around the phone. "What about it?" "Oh, nothing serious," she said quickly. "Olivia just thought it was strange. Some reporter asked if you were involved when it was sold. I told her you probably weren't. You would have said something if it were true, right?" I let the silence stretch. "You can tell them whatever makes sense, Mom." She hesitated. "So it's not true." I smiled to myself. "Just believe what you want to believe." Her voice softened. "Emily, you know we only want the best for you. I just don't want you dragged into anything messy before the wedding." "I'm fine," I said quietly. "Don't worry about me." When we hung up, I stood for a long time with the phone still in my hand. Through the open window came the faint hum of the generator, the clinking of tools, the rhythm of people preparing for a celebration that wasn't theirs. By mid-afternoon, the vineyard shimmered under the sun. I walked the path leading to the ceremony site. Rows of chairs were stacked neatly along the lawn, waiting to be arranged for Olivia's big day. I reached the back row and brushed my fingers over the cool wood of one of the seats. I remembered every table, every gathering, every time they'd placed me just far enough away that I couldn't ruin the view. The farthest seat, the quiet corner, that had always been my place. But looking at it now, I realized something. Every chair, even the ones at the back, had its purpose. The back row still faced the altar. It still saw everything. I turned toward the stage where the white curtains swayed gently in the wind. The sound technician tested the speakers. A low hum vibrated through the ground. The air felt charged like the split second before a storm breaks. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the vines, the faint perfume of lilies, drifting from the boxes nearby. I had chosen silence once because it protected me. Now, maybe it was time to let the noise find me. The truth was already on its way. And once it arrived, nothing. No wedding, no title, no perfect family image would stay untouched. I opened my eyes and looked up at the sky. The first thin clouds were beginning to roll in from the west. Somewhere beyond them, a headline was being typed, my name making its way back into the world. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. The morning of the wedding was bright and impossibly clear, the kind of day photographers dream about. The sun stretched across the rows of vines, gilding every leaf with gold. A breeze drifted through the valley, carrying the mingled scent of roses, champagne, and anticipation. From the terrace above, I could hear laughter and the hum of conversation as guests arrived. Down below, the ceremony site shimmered in white and pale blush. Hundreds of chairs lined the lawn ribbons, fluttering in the wind. I stood at a distance, half hidden by a row of olive trees, watching as people filled their seats. Olivia was radiant in her gown, the kind of dress that whispered money. Lace sleeves, a train long enough to sweep the earth pearls woven through her hair. Mom and Dad hovered nearby, both glowing with pride. The photographers circled like bees, their flashes catching her every smile. She spotted me as I approached the edge of the crowd. Her face softened into a polite smile, but her eyes remained sharp. Emily. She said, her voice low but pointed, "Remember what I told you last night? Sit near the back, okay? We want the photos to look balanced." I nodded. "Of course." She seemed satisfied and turned back to the camera, lifting her chin just so. I found a quiet spot beneath a shade tree where I could see the ceremony without being in the frame. My fingers trailed along the wooden armrest of the chair. The wood was smooth and cool. I almost laughed. I smiled because she didn't know she was standing on my land. Guests began to hush as the music shifted to a softer melody. The string quartet played, and the processional began, bridesmaids gliding down the aisle in matching champagne gowns. Daniel's family looking on proudly. Everything moved in perfect rhythm, as if rehearsed 1,000 times. But perfection has its limits. It's always waiting for the moment something small, something invisible decides to break. It came in the form of Sarah, the wedding planner, her face pale as she clutched her phone near the sound booth. She whispered urgently to one of the coordinators, who quickly ran toward Olivia's mother. Within seconds, the energy changed, subtle but sharp enough to feel it ripple through the air. Olivia turned, frowning. "What's going on?" Sarah hurried over, holding a stack of papers. "There's been a mistake," she said softly. "The contract for the venue hasn't been re-signed under the new ownership. Legally, we need confirmation before the ceremony can proceed." Olivia blinked confusion, turning to irritation. New ownership. What new ownership? Sarah's voice dropped. "The estate was sold last month. We need a signature from the current owner for the wedding to continue." Daniel stepped forward. "Who's the new owner?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking toward me for a split second before she looked back at them. A woman named Emily Carter. The silence that followed was almost cinematic. The chatter died instantly. Olivia froze, her face draining of color. "That's not funny," she said. "You must mean another Carter." Sarah shook her head. "No, ma'am. I double-checked the records with the county. Rosewood belongs to Emily Carter." Daniel looked between us, his brow furrowing. "Olivia, maybe we should what?" She snapped, her voice breaking. "You think this is some kind of joke?" I stepped forward slowly, my heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. "It's not a joke," I said quietly. Everyone turned. Dozens of eyes followed me as I crossed the lawn. The air felt heavier with every step, though the sky stayed heartbreakingly blue. Sarah exhaled in relief. "Ms. Carter," she said, "thank you for coming. We just need your signature on the venue confirmation." She handed me the papers and a pen. I signed where she pointed, each stroke calm and deliberate. The pen didn't shake. When I handed the folder back, Sarah smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. Everything's settled now." Olivia's voice was small. "Mrs. Carter?" Sarah glanced at her, confused. "The owner," she said. "It's standard etiquette." Mom's voice trembled as she stepped forward. "Emily. Sweetheart, what is this?" I looked at her gently. "Nothing." "Mom, just paperwork." The cameras flashed again, but no one was smiling now. I could see the guests whispering their curiosity, buzzing like static. Olivia stood, frozen, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hand. Daniel reached for her arm, but she pulled away. The officiant, unsure, cleared his throat and asked softly if they should begin. Olivia gave a stiff nod, forcing a smile for the audience. The music started again, too loud, too cheerful. I moved back toward the edge of the crowd, the sun warm on my shoulders. Behind me, vows were being recited in shaky voices. Laughter returned, but it sounded hollow. I paused by the edge of the terrace, looking over the rows of vines swaying in the afternoon light. The wind brushed my hair, carrying the faint sound of applause from behind me. Karma doesn't need an audience. It just needs the right moment. I took a slow breath and walked down the gravel path leading toward the vineyard. The sounds of the ceremony faded until all that remained was the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of music. The light was blindingly beautiful as I stepped into the sun, the kind of brightness that hides everything it touches. The wind rose softly, and for a second it sounded almost like clapping. The reception ended hours ago, but the echo of music still lingered in the air. The candles had burned down to stubs the scent of wine, and roses clung to the empty tables, and the guests had long since disappeared into the night. Somewhere in the main villa, laughter from Daniel's friends had faded into the low hum of distant crickets. I was sitting outside the guest house by the lake, a cup of tea cooling between my palms, the night still and heavy with the sound of summer insects. The stars over Napa Valley were impossibly bright, their reflections trembling in the dark water. Then, across the vineyard, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps, heels striking the gravel path. When she appeared framed in the doorway, Olivia looked nothing like the flawless bride she'd been hours earlier. Her hair was undone, her makeup streaked her wedding dress replaced by a silk robe that clung to her shoulders. Behind her, the thin curtains of the guest house fluttered in the wind, pale as smoke. "Emily," she said, her voice sharp, cracking at the edges. I looked up from my chair. "You're still awake." She didn't move closer. "Sarah called me." I didn't need to ask what she meant. She said the new owner of Rosewood Estate, the one who had to sign the contract, was you. Olivia's voice shook. "Is that true?" I set the cup down carefully on the small table. "It's true." She took a step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath her. "Why didn't you tell me?" I tilted my head. "You never asked." Her hands clenched at her sides. "Don't do that. Don't act like this was nothing. You let me stand there in front of everyone." Her breath caught. "You let me look like a fool." I stayed quiet, the only sound between us, the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint chirp of crickets outside. "You wanted to humiliate me," she said finally, her tone almost a whisper. "This was your revenge, wasn't it?" I met her eyes, calm and steady. "No, I didn't do anything to you, Olivia. I simply bought a property. You happened to choose it." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked around the room like she was seeing it for the first time. The walls, the open door, the faint scent of lavender drifting from the window. "You bought this entire place," she said, disbelief breaking into her voice. "All of it." I nodded once. 3 months ago." Her voice hardened. "You could have told me." "I could have," I said, "but every time we talk, you already know everything. You never leave room for me to tell you anything new." She sank into the chair across from me, shoulders shaking. "You let me treat you like you were beneath me. You let Mom and Dad think you were struggling." "It was easier," I said. "They were comfortable with that version of me." Her laugh came out hollow. "And now you own the vineyard where I got married. Now," I said softly, "you've seen that the story was never what you thought it was." The silence between us stretched long. She pressed her palms to her face, her voice breaking. "I've been awful to you." I didn't answer. There was nothing to correct. Finally, she dropped her hands and looked up at me. Why didn't you tell me about your company, about selling it? You made millions and said nothing." I leaned back in the chair, looking out toward the dark vineyard. "Because the money didn't change how you saw me. I could have told you, and you'd still have found a way to make it small, so I stopped needing you to see it." Her eyes glistened. "I don't even recognize myself tonight." "You do," I said. "You're just seeing yourself without the stage lights." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only movement came from the curtains swaying in the wind, and the faint flicker of the lamp between us. She whispered, "I was wrong." I turned to her. "No one stays wrong forever. Not if they're willing to look at themselves." Her lips trembled, and for a second she looked like the sister I used to share a room with when we were little. The girl who used to braid my hair and sneak cookies from the kitchen with me after bedtime. Then, as quickly as it appeared, that image was gone. "I can't fix this," she said quietly. "I didn't ask you to." She stood slowly, gripping the edge of the chair as if it might steady her. "I should go." I nodded. "It's late." She walked toward the door but stopped before stepping outside. The wind lifted her hair, the night pressing in around her. "You deserved better than how I treated you." "I got exactly what I needed," I said. She turned, her eyes wet, but clear now. "Good night, Emily." "Good night, Olivia." When the door closed, the house fell into silence again. I sat for a while listening to the soft ticking of the clock, the hum of cicadas beyond the window, the faint echo of footsteps fading into the distance. Out on the porch, the air was cooler. I leaned against the railing, looking up at the sky. The stars stretched wide and endless above the vineyard, the same vineyard that had carried both our stories, even when she hadn't known it. Sometimes silence is the only way people can finally hear what's been there all along. The night didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt finished. And somewhere beyond the hills, the first winds of the coming storm began to stir. The news broke just after sunrise. I was standing in the kitchen pouring coffee when my phone started buzzing nonstop. Texts, emails, calls, notifications, lighting up like fireworks. At first, I thought it was about the wedding, maybe some leftover gossip from the night before. But when I opened the first message from Mark, the headline stared back at me in bold print. Emily Carter, the hidden founder behind Cloudframe Systems, and the woman who owns Rosewood Vineyard. The article spread like wildfire across every major news outlet within hours. Tech blogs ran old photos of me from 2018 screenshots of archived web pages, contract filings, even a still frame from the wedding the day before. Me standing in the sunlight, pen in hand, signing the ownership document. By the time the morning shows picked it up, I had already turned my phone face down. On the television in my parents' living room, a reporter's voice filled the air. The revelation shocked both the tech and social communities. Emily Carter, previously known only as the younger sister of investment executive Olivia Carter, was identified as the secret majority owner of Cloudframe Systems, acquired by Macronet in 2020 for $420 million. Carter, who now resides at her privately owned Rosewood Vineyard, declined to comment. Dad sat on the couch, jaw tight, hands clasped together. I always knew she was capable of something. He murmured, almost convincing himself. I've always been proud of her. Mom stood behind him, arms crossed, her face pale. The reporter switched to footage of me leaving the vineyard months ago, sunglasses on, hair pulled back, carrying a stack of folders. She blinked quickly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. I didn't know she whispered. I didn't know any of it. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia sat in the hotel suite with Daniel, her phone vibrating endlessly on the nightstand. She didn't answer any of the calls. She stared at the photo of me on the screen, standing at Rosewood's terrace, wind lifting my hair, a caption below it reading, "The quiet genius who built an empire in silence." Her hands shook slightly as she set the phone down. Daniel poured her coffee and sat beside her. "You should call her," he said softly. Olivia's voice cracked. "I don't even know what I'd say." "Start with the truth," he said. "She didn't do this to embarrass you. She didn't have to. You and your family already did that on your own." She turned to him, defensive, at first, then deflated. "We just never thought she—" "Exactly," he interrupted. "You never thought." He handed her the mug and stood walking to the window. Outside, the valley was still wrapped in sunlight, the same light that had illuminated our family's best and worst moments. At Rosewood, I finally opened my laptop. Every outlet had run a variation of the same story. Some were respectful, others were sensational. The woman who fooled Silicon Valley. The billionaire who lived like a ghost. The sister no one saw coming. My inbox was overflowing. Requests for interviews, podcast invitations, congratulations from people I hadn't spoken to in years. I scrolled past them all until I reached a new message from Mark. Macronet's legal department confirmed the piece is fully compliant. The NDA was limited to 5 years and expired last quarter. You're officially free, no restrictions. I stared at the words for a long time. "Free," Mark called a few minutes later. "Well," he said, his tone almost amused, "you're trending on every business feed in the country." I laughed softly. "That's one way to wake up. Are you all right?" "I think so." I paused. It's strange. For the first time in a decade, there's nothing left to hide behind. "You sound calm," he said. "I am," I replied. "Maybe this is what freedom feels like." He chuckled. "Then enjoy it, Emily. It's about time the world caught up to who you've always been." After the call ended, I set the phone aside and stepped out onto the veranda. The sun had climbed higher, bathing the vineyard in gold. The wind played softly through the vines, tugging at the edges of my linen shirt. The air smelled of earth and ripened fruit, steady and real. It was almost funny how the same family that once laughed at my little computer projects would now have to read about them on national news. When people finally start to feel proud of you, it often means you've stopped needing them to. I drove through the vineyard that afternoon, the tires crunching over gravel rows of vines stretching endlessly in every direction. My hair whipped around my face, and the hum of the engine blended with the sound of wind rushing through the leaves. The past 10 years played in flashes behind my eyes, late nights in Palo Alto, the first server humming to life the silence of being dismissed the sale that no one in my family cared to ask about. And now, all at once, everyone cared. That was the irony. They were proud only when it became public, when the world decided I mattered. I smiled to myself. Let them have their pride. I had my peace. Later that evening, Mom found an old photo on the living room shelf. 2 little girls in white dresses standing side by side under a cherry blossom tree. Olivia's arm was draped protectively around my shoulders. We couldn't have been older than 7 and 10. Mom sat on the edge of the couch holding the frame for a long time before her tears began to fall. She picked up the phone and dialed my number. When I answered, neither of us spoke for several seconds. "Emily," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'd like to talk, please." "When you're ready to really see me," I said softly. "I'll be here." The silence on the line was long-waited, but not cruel. "I love you," she said just before hanging up. I stood by the window watching the sunlight fade over the vines. The last notes of a wedding song drifted faintly through my memory. The laughter, the applause, the camera flashes. All the noise of a family that had never really listened. The vineyard was quiet now, the valley bathed in gold. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. Sometimes peace arrives, disguised as the sound of everything falling into place. 2 months later, the vineyard had turned gold. The air was softer now, crisp and sweet, with the scent of ripened grapes and the first hints of autumn. Leaves drifted down from the olive trees, covering the gravel paths, like confetti from a celebration long over. I had set a table outside on the terrace. Simple wooden, weathered from the sun. A few bottles of red, some bread still warm from the oven. Slices of cheese, roasted figs, and cinnamon pastries I'd baked that morning. The sky stretched wide and pale blue above us, the kind of light that makes even the quiet moments feel cinematic. They arrived just after noon. Mom was the first to step out of the car, clutching a small bouquet of dahlias, her eyes darting around as if unsure where to stand. Dad followed slower, his expression unreadable. Olivia came last, her coat draped over her arm, a thin envelope clutched tightly in her hand. "Everything looks beautiful," Mom said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you," I said. I thought we could sit outside. The weather's too good to waste." We took our seats around the table. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the soft creak of chairs as we adjusted ourselves. I poured wine for everyone and raised my glass first. "To family," I said quietly. Dad hesitated before nodding. "To family." The clinking of glass against glass was soft but carried more weight than any toast I could remember. He set his drink down and cleared his throat. "Emily." He began, his voice low, halting. I owe you an apology. I wasn't fair to you." I looked at him, studying the deep lines around his eyes. "You don't have to apologize, Dad." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "You built something extraordinary, and instead of asking, I assumed. I thought success had to look a certain way. I thought it had to be loud, visible. I didn't realize how small that made me sound." I smiled gently. "You were doing what you thought was right. Everyone loves differently, Dad. Sometimes we hurt people without meaning to, especially when we think we're protecting them." He nodded, his throat tight. "You sound like your mother." Mom let out a shaky laugh, tears spilling before she could stop them. She reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers. "I'm so sorry, Em. For every time we made you feel invisible. For every seat we pushed you into because we thought that's where you belonged." I squeezed her fingers lightly. "You don't need to be sorry. I stopped feeling invisible a long time ago." Olivia had been quiet the whole time, her eyes fixed on her wine glass. When she finally looked up, her eyes were rimmed red. "I brought something," she said softly, sliding the envelope across the table toward me. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, her handwriting looping and uneven. I opened it carefully. "You don't belong in the back row anymore," it read. "You never did. You've always been front and center even when no one could see it." I looked up at her. She tried to smile, but her voice broke. I didn't know how to say it out loud. For a moment, the wind picked up, scattering a few leaves across the table. I let the paper rest against my palm, the words sinking in like sunlight. "Thank you," I said simply. We sat together in silence after that. Not the strained silence of old dinners, but something gentler, like the air had learned to breathe with us. Mom refilled everyone's glasses. Dad passed the bread. Olivia reached for the figs. Slowly, conversation returned in small fragments. The weather, Daniel's new job, Mom's garden, the ridiculous traffic on Highway 29. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. After lunch, I stood and said, "Come on, there's something I want to show you." They followed me down the winding path toward the old ceremony site. The wooden arch still stood there, its white drapery now soft and faded, fluttering in the breeze. The rows of chairs had been moved into storage, except for one, left deliberately at the back. "This is where it happened." Dad said, his voice low. "Yes," I replied. "And that seat back there," I pointed to the lone chair by the edge of the lawn, "that used to be mine." They all turned, following my gaze. The chair looked small, half covered in fallen leaves. "But I made a change," I said. "From now on, the last row is reserved for VIP guests, people who had to fight hardest to earn their seat." Mom laughed through her tears. Olivia covered her face with her hands, shaking her head. Even Dad let out a low chuckle. I smiled, the weight in my chest loosening. You see, sometimes being at the back gives you the best view of everything. We stood there together, the wind lifting Olivia's hair, sunlight spilling through the vines. Forgiveness isn't about deserving it. It's about deciding you don't want to carry the heaviness anymore. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, I looked at them. My imperfect, loud, beautiful family, and felt something shift quietly inside me. The vineyard shimmered in the golden light, and for the first time I realized we were all exactly where we were supposed to be. The leaves danced in the air like tiny pieces of grace falling softly onto the earth that had seen everything and still chose to bloom. 3 months later, autumn melted into early winter, and the vineyard wore a softer kind of beauty. The vines had shed their leaves. The air carried the faint chill of rain, and the sky looked washed clean. I spent most mornings in the greenhouse at the back of the property, surrounded by lavender and rosemary. The faint hum of the heater filling the quiet. The long wooden table before me was covered in bundles of herbs, envelopes, and a single sheet of parchment. The letter I'd been writing had no rush to be finished. "Dear Mrs. Rosewood, thank you for trusting me with this place. You once told me it didn't need perfection, only someone who listens. You were right. It's not just a vineyard, it's a beginning." I signed my name slowly and folded the letter, sealing it with a simple wax stamp. The lavender scent lingered in the air long after I set my pen down. From the window, I could see the hills glowing faintly in the pale light. The estate was quiet now. No events, no noise, no rehearsals or camera flashes. Just rows of vines resting before spring, the way people do after they've said everything that needed to be said. A soft knock came from the door. Mark Evans stepped inside, brushing a few raindrops from his coat. "Busy as always," he said, glancing at the flowers. "I see retirement suits you." "I'm not retired," I said, smiling. "Just finally living at my own pace." He chuckled. "That's rarer than money, you know." In his hands was a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. He placed it gently on the table. "I thought you might want this," he said. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed photograph. The one taken at Olivia and Daniel's wedding, after everything had settled. The 4 of us sat together in the front row, sunlight falling over our faces. Olivia's hand rested lightly on mine. Even Mom was smiling a little shy, as if she were learning how again. "I think you should have the original," Mark said. "It belongs here." I stared at the photo for a long moment. "You always know what I need before I do." "It's a gift," he said. "Occupational hazard for lawyers who pay attention." I laughed softly. "You've been more than that." "Thank you, Mark, for everything," he nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. "So what's next for you, Ms. Carter?" "Another company, another mystery project that'll make me sign 10 NDAs. I shook my head. "No more secrets. Just this." I gestured toward the greenhouse, the vines beyond it, the quiet hum of the land. For the first time in my life, I'm not building something to prove I can. I'm just tending what's already enough. He smiled, the kind that carried both pride and peace. "Then I'll leave you to it." After he left, I placed the framed photograph on my desk right beside the deed to Rosewood Estate. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the signature still looked as deliberate as the day I wrote it. Karma isn't about revenge. It's a mirror that reflects exactly what we send into the world. I stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The vineyard stretched endlessly before me, rows of vines asleep beneath the soft fog. My boots sank lightly into the damp soil as I walked, the sound of the earth beneath my feet, grounding and steady. At the end of the path, the fields opened wide. I ran my hand along the rough wood of the fence, fingertips brushing against the few last leaves still clinging stubbornly to the vines. The wind moved through them, a soft rustling like the whisper of applause. Above, a small plane crossed the valley, its silver wings catching the sun. It reminded me of freedom, the kind that isn't about escape, but about returning to yourself. I stopped walking, my breath visible in the cool air, and looked toward the horizon where the light began to fade into a soft, golden hue. I don't need to win, I said quietly. I just need to be at peace. The sky answered with silence, the kind that holds everything, grief, forgiveness, and the fragile beauty of letting go, as the sun dipped lower, painting the hills in shades of amber, and rose the entire vineyard glowed. From above, it must have looked like a living heart, steady and full. The wind picked up once more, warm and gentle, against my face, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the greenhouse. I closed my eyes and let it pass over me, a quiet benediction. Peace doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly after the noise fades. If someone once made you feel small, if they told you that you didn't belong, remember this. You never need to sit near the stage to shine.